So, is it the case that some of the stories written in the Gospels are considered to be true because they're not something that the authors would likely make up? This is called the criterion of embarrassment, and I'll give a few examples, including one that's very popular among Christian apologists that makes me want to recreate Michael Flatley's Lord of the Dance in a minefield. But since there were no cameras in ancient history, historians have a list of criterion that they use to determine whether something did or did not happen in history. Some of those criterion are more reliable than others, and the criterion of embarrassment would fall into the others category. Sometimes it's considered, but generally it's avoided, like the interstate during rush hour. Apologists, however, love taking the interstate during rush hour, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Now, in relation to that last video I talked about where Jesus' disciples were carrying swords when he was arrested or not, this criterion is the reason that some historians think there is a nugget of truth to the story. Given Jesus' consistent teachings against violence, it would be weird if suddenly his disciples were armed, thus it must be somewhat true. But again, given what we know about everything else, like Pontius Pilate's zero-tolerance policy for even unarmed rebellions, how Jesus' disciples were not supposed to have any personal belongings like the Jedi, and just how expensive swords were and how difficult they were to attain by a commoner, as some people correctly pointed out in the comments. So even though the criterion of embarrassment is there, as well as the criterion of multiple attestation, it does not stand up against all the rest. Now, by comparison, where this criterion is most commonly used is with the crucifixion of Jesus himself. It was a huge problem for early Christians that their Messiah was crucified. That wasn't supposed to happen. And what followed was a laundry list of early Christians, including Paul himself, who had to come up with reasons as to why this happened. Some even went as far as to say, yeah, this happened, but he was a spiritual being and didn't feel any pain, so it wasn't really that big of a deal. Now, my favorite example of this, Twitch, is used ad nauseum by people like Frank Turek and William Lane Craig. That is the story of the women discovering the empty tomb. Back then, women's testimonies were not considered valuable at all compared to a man's, so why would they make that up? Because that is bullshit, that's why. For one thing, we have the story from the 1st century historian and Roman official Tacitus, in a letter he wrote to the emperor, and in it he says, yo, I'm trying to get more information on these Christians, so I've been torturing Christian slave women to get information, and here's what they told me. But what gets me even more than that is how these apologists seem to not have read anything about ancient Jewish burial and practices. If they did, they would know it was the women's job to care for the tomb and the body. Men were not allowed to, because if they went near a dead body, it would render them ceremonially unclean and thus unable to perform their duties at the temple. So in reality, this doesn't actually meet the already flimsy criterion of embarrassment. If early Christians read that the tomb was discovered by men, they would have been like, can we change that or just take it out completely? Anyway, end of rant. Thank you for the question, and I hope you enjoyed.